let me help you switch to the slides.
The last part, DNA and heredity. And the question, what role DNA plays in regards to heredity. It's a fact, of course, that we inherit our parents' genes. There's no question about that. But what do those genes exactly determine? To what extent do they determine who we become? And in the first place, that influence is limited because DNA only concerns physical properties. It concerns the information for physical building blocks, so it's only restricted to the characteristics of our body. The Bouke speaks about the germplasm, which is the name for DNA before it was discovered, as being the concreted deposit or concretion of the reincarnating man. So DNA is not the cause of who we are, we explained it already, but a result. And you could say it is the physical reflection of the inner man. We are our consciousness, we have a body, and the consciousness of the inner man is leading. And according to the universal principle of life within life, as we have discussed, we emanate a field, we determine the pattern, we ourselves are the blueprint, you can say, in which ourselves come into expression. It is our consciousness that permeates and activates our physical cells that in their turn activate the required part of the DNA. As a bundle of spiritual, mental and psychic forces, as the Bouke describes, man works through his physical body. And from this consciousness viewpoint, a number of other phenomena can be explained as well. For example, the fact that 50% of our DNA is similar to that of a banana, despite the fact that we are obviously completely different. And that is because in both cases, the consciousness of each being working through these cells activates the DNA in a different way, resulting, of course, in different building blocks and therefore also in a different body. And another example, another phenomena that we can understand better now is the sudden change in form and function that takes place during the life of an organism, as we witness in the case of plant cuttings, for example, something that we are familiar with. You cut a stem, put it in water, and no much later you see newly formed roots starting to grow. We are so familiar with this process that we take it for granted, but scientifically there's actually no good explanation why cells change both in structure and function from one moment to the next. Another example is also a caterpillar becoming a butterfly. But in the case of cuttings, why cells that formed the stem at first suddenly change into root cells and form the roots within the shortest time. The same cells containing the same DNA and yet a sudden change because the expression of the DNA is changed by the plant consciousness to meet the requirements of the new situation. And a last example, less known but no less impressive, is that of some fish species that can even completely change their gender when needed, as is the case with this clownfish. When the dominant female on top of the hierarchy leaves a population, the oldest male in that population changes into a female just in a few days to take over her position. Yet another example that shows a significant change, a complete new set of genes being activated, causing a fish to undergo an entire sex change in a few days. Again, same DNA, different expression. These are all examples that cannot be explained from the detailed level, from an inductive approach, because they occur at the level of the individual, the overshadowing consciousness, so to say, of the being directing these processes. But yet, with some regularity, scientific research is published that mentions a new gene being discovered that is held responsible for a certain behavior or a certain psychical character trait. So how can this then be the case? But then we have to go back again to the point we started with, the importance of the right assumptions we use for our research. and the pitfalls, so to say, that the science has to deal with. Because the thing that happens in this kind of research is that from a materialistic point of view, an assumption is made which principally is not right in the first place. The idea, namely, that matter is the only reality leads to the assumption that the only possible cause for our character has to be found in our physical genes. It's not even questioned anymore. And as a consequence, the method that is used in this kind of research is also incorrect to start with. So how is this kind of research done? Among a group of people with a particular behavior, the genes are examined and searched for a specific gene that all members of the group have in common. And if such a gene is found, the conclusion is drawn that this specific gene must account for that particular behavior. And in these so-called genetic association studies, a correlation between specific genes and behavior is being searched by means of statistics. And it was also this kind of research in which the so-called fear for mathematics gene was found. But the misconception here is that correlation is not yet causation. That is something fundamentally different. And let me explain this with another example. If during a research on the preference for vanilla ice cream is discovered that left-handed people eat vanilla ice cream more often, then you can say, yes, there's a correlation. But of course, it's nonsense to state that left-handedness is the cause of having a preference for vanilla ice cream. In addition to this, there are always exceptions in this kind of research. There are always people who do have a particular gene, but not the characteristic being looked for. And also correlations that are found are often so weak that things like lifestyle or environmental factors turn out to be of greater influence than the specific genes. Another problem scientists are confronted with is that traits prove to be much more difficult to predict than initially thought. When DNA just had been discovered, the idea soon arose that in the near future we would be able to predict exactly what characteristics a person would have, whether someone would have blue or brown eyes, for example, be intelligent or not, etc. But the truth is far from that, since the more we discover, the less things appear to be fixed and predictable. One-on-one translation of DNA to a specific trait proves to be hardly possible. First of all, the question is what part of the DNA is activated, since genes can be switched on and off, as we have seen in case of the clownfish that can change their sex. And secondly, the moment a gene is activated, it's often not certain which exact building block it will become. And that is because one gene can be converted into multiple types of building blocks that can differ in both structure and function. In fruit flies, for example, a gene has been discovered that can be converted into 30,000 different proteins. And finally, specific building blocks can have multiple functions. In other words, using the analogy of building a house again, you can use a piece of wood for the window frame, but you can also use it for the staircase, for example. Or to use the recipe book comparison again, you think you're starting with a recipe for tacos, but you end up with tortillas on your plate. So considering DNA only, it's hardly possible to predict in what final properties it will result. And this is the reason why even something like hair color or eye color cannot be predicted with certainty. And if you think this over for a moment, you must conclude that DNA actually is not even a blueprint, but rather the toolbox we have at our disposal to express ourselves. But actually, I have to say, living beings of a primitive level that we have a cooperation with. So, if we are not our DNA, then what are we? As I already said, we are consciousness. We have a body, but we are our consciousness. And more specifically, you could say that the part of our consciousness that we express, we can call our character. The total sum of all our thoughts, actions, and habits that we have formed in our previous incarnations. we become exactly that which we have made of ourselves, what we have developed or activated within ourselves from the infinite stream of consciousness that we essentially are. And in this, everybody is unique. And that is the reason why even identical twins, despite being genetically identical, can have a totally different character, and why even on the physical plane, they have different fingerprints. In other words, we inherit ourselves. The teaching that in the Hindu tradition is known as Svabhava, or the doctrine of self-becoming. Based on reincarnation and karma, we become ourselves again. We attract everything we left behind the previous time. This applies for our circumstances, our family and friends, and the place where we are born, but it also applies for our bodies. Based on that same attraction or resonance, we attract again all those cells, all those life atoms with whom we start our cooperation once again. And if we at last take a look at evolution from this theosophical perspective, it sheds a different light on that as well. Then evolution is no longer a physical change of form, a transformation over time based on random mutations, as Neo-Darwinism teaches, but a matter of ever-expanding consciousness and ever-changing cooperation. Evolution means an increasingly unfolding of latent inner capacities, as is described so well by the Latin word evolvere, which literally means unfold or develop. And it's a process of developing our consciousness from inside out. A development with a clear aim and purpose to express more and more the boundless faculties of the divine being that we essentially are. And remember again the three states of consciousness that we started with, to be able to see reality, the faculties of discernment, understanding, and inspiration, the ability to experience the oneness of life. And by developing these aspects within us, we will become ever more universal, and each time we will be able to understand a little bit more of the reality. And finally, as a consequence of the development of our inner faculties, our physical body will naturally follow along. As a result of our expanding consciousness, we will correspondingly attract and cooperate with those cells, that quality of living beings, which are fit to give expression to every new phase in our evolutionary journey. This is what I wanted to share with you. We have one more break now, and then one more opportunity for your questions. Okay, we are back again.
Yes, we have a question. Yeah. Yes. When we change our character, does our DNA change accordingly?
Yeah, I think, principally it will. And think again of cooperation. So if we change our character, the cooperation with the more primitive beings will change accordingly. But I'm a bit hesitant in my answer because the amount of DNA in the cell is enormous. I read that if you have the DNA from one cell, you can have a string of 2 meters. And if you put together the DNA of our whole body, you can go 6,000 times to the moon and back. And what I want to say is we activate a certain part of the DNA. And you can also say that if we change our character, we will change a different part of the DNA that we activate, maybe. That's what I'm thinking of. For example, if you have a certain character and you go to a library, you read a certain quality of books. But if you change your character and you become wiser, you go to the same library, but you just pick different books to read. It's not a really fitting analogy, but to give an idea that this DNA has has a lot of opportunities within itself.
Yeah. And an accompanying question would perhaps be, can beings influence each other? So we talked a lot about people changing their characters, and that DNA then changes perhaps, or that you use different things from your toolbox. But can others influence you as well to use different things from your toolbox?
Do you mean literally genetical manipulation, or
No,
something
not
different?
directly, but that, well, perhaps when you have friends, you can talk with each other.
Yeah.
And perhaps
of course.
maybe in that way, others can basically influence your DNA in a
In that
sense.
sense. Yeah. Well, you can, of course, always communicate and be inspired by other people and by talking with others and changing your own character. So
Yes, exactly.
yeah.
Let me see if there are questions in the chat. No, I don't see any there. Maybe another new in the mail. Yeah, we have another question. Let me see. When medics start editing DNA, so manipulation, basically, what consequences flow from that? What happens then? What consequences, perhaps even practical and, I don't know, maybe character-wise?
It's always difficult to say what will happen, but one thing you can say for sure is there's a naturally cooperation based on resonance, on harmony, on the law of attraction. And if you manipulate on that level, you can say that you force a different cooperation. And on a larger scale, you see it with organ donation. Then you see that the people who have a new organ, they need to have medicine in order not to reject the organ, because it's also kind of a forced cooperation. So I don't know the direct result, although you can say, of course, in plant cultivation, there's a lot of manipulation to make sure that a certain crop doesn't get a certain disease. But what you also see on the other hand, that crop might be resistant for a certain disease, but at the same time, it becomes really vulnerable on other levels.
Monoculture.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So principally, the answer is you force the cooperation, but how it actually results, in what it results, you don't know. I know that about how do you call it? Gen therapy.
Epigenetica? Was it epigenetica or was it?
No, that's something different.
Oh,
that is
I'm sorry.
exactly the interesting science that they discover that genes can be switched on and off. So they see that a being can influence the genes. This is the answer.
But when something like that is changed, does it also tend to move back to its natural position?
Oh, I'm happy you mentioned it, because there's this example of fruit flies. Fruit flies is a really famous subject for research, because they don't have too many genes. And they succeeded once in a study to create a super fruit fly, to make its wings bigger and so on, to select it, to cultivate it to a super fruit fly. But what they saw is, as soon as they left it alone, within 3 generations, it got back to its original state. And that is really interesting, because then you see there is this force behind.
Yeah, tendency to go back to the natural
state. Yeah.
Okay, that was it. Let me check YouTube. No, that was it. Yes.
Okay. Then you've come to the end of the lecture. Well, if there are more questions, next week we continue with this subject with the study via Zoom. And you can sign up for it via our website if you want to join the discussion. So, hope to see you next week. For now, as always, we will close the lecture with the Gayatri, a verse of the Rig Veda, which speaks about a golden sun. And this golden sun is our innermost essence, which we will gradually activate and express more and more during our evolutionary journey. O thou golden sun of most excellent splendor, illumine our hearts and fill our minds, so that we, recognizing our oneness with the divinity, which is the heart of the universe, may see the pathway before our feet and tread it to those distant goals of perfection, stimulated by thine own radiant light.